Welcome to our discussion today about the introduction to prose and poetry and the UIL Prose and Poetry Contest. I'm Jana Riggins, your State Director for Speech, Debate, and Congress, and I'm delighted to be here today with you to discuss prose and poetry, amazing contest that we sponsor at UIL. This discussion is rather involved and detailed, so you may want to grab something to take some notes with as we progress. I can't share with you everything you need to do to completely prepare for this contest, but I certainly can hope to offer you a great deal of information as you start this journey of learning how to compete in prose and poetry. So let's look at a preview of our session today. I'll give you an overview of the contest and talk about the rules and procedures. I think that's the first thing one should always do when they're beginning a new contest, and that is learn the rules and learn how the contest actually works. The next thing we'll do is we'll review the categories. Categories may be a strange name to you right now, but I'll explain that very quickly. And then we'll talk about documentation requirements. And finally, how do we practice? And how do we prepare? So let's begin this journey together today. First of all, let's define what oral interpretation really is. Oral interpretation focuses on literature and performance through expressive oral reading. The key phrase there is oral reading. When you begin to practice and you begin to your journey into prose and poetry, realize this is not an acting contest. It's actually an expressive reading contest. So let's look at rules and let's look at procedures. Where do I find these rules? How do I know what they are? Well, there are three major publications that the UIL provides for you as resources, so you know how the contest actually runs and what rules you need to adhere to. First of all, our Constitution. Secondly, and very importantly, is our Prose and Poetry Handbook that is available online on the UIL Oral Interpretation webpage. You just click on the button, you download it, and it's free for as many of your students and you as coaches that you might like to have. And thirdly, the UIL Oral Interpretation webpage that I referred to. It has lots of resources far beyond what I'm going to share with you today. And that would be a major place providing lots of resources for you. Overall, generally, when you become involved in any UIL activity, as far as the academic, speech, debate, and theater is concerned, you want to understand the academic conflict pattern. This is really something that your coach wants to look over with you and explain to you. Coaches, it's a graph that you will find online and in all of our publications. We have an obligation to keep you in school as much as possible, and so we created a conflict pattern of all the 30 events that we offer in high school academics and speech and debate. It shows you which events conflict with one another in order for someone to be able to administer a meet in a day to a day and a half. So be sure you check the academic conflict pattern found on your UIL website. The second thing you want to be aware of is you must also comply with speech event restrictions. Speech events have restrictions that other academic events do not have, and that is because we have multiple rounds when we compete. If you compete in prose and poetry, you will have a preliminary round, and you will also have a final round. If you compete in debate, you're going to have multiple preliminary rounds and then elimination rounds, sometimes up to 8 rounds before you finish a competition. So you can see that that involves a lot of time, and it forces us to have these restrictions. The restrictions you want to pay attention to is that if you enter prose, you may not also be in poetry, and you also cannot enter Lincoln Douglas, or what we call LD, debate. If you enter poetry, you may not enter prose or LD. And as you look through the official rules, I want to guide you with a very important word. Whenever you see the word shall in a sentence, in one of the rules, that means you absolutely must do it. It is mandatory. So shall is a very critical word as you study the contest rules. Let me just give you an overview, sort of a general rule on all of the prose and poetry. And that is, first of all, as a performer, you prepare 2 oral reading performances. And the league actually defines, gives you a box, if you will say, 4 categories. We have a category A and a category B. And that's how you create your 2 performances within those boundaries, within that box. The time limit for your performance cannot go beyond 7 minutes. So always think my time limit is under 7. So you want to be safe with that. It does require an introduction into your performance. It does require that you read from a manuscript. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And there can be no costumes and no props. Those are your general rules. So let's look at this difference. If you're new to these contests and you're new to literature and performing literature, what's the difference between prose or poetry? How do I know which contest I would be best at? Well, think about what you've learned in your English classes. Prose includes things like short stories, novels, writings that are very conversational in the way the language flows, full grammatical sentences, everyday language, and very much in opposition to what we see in poetry, because poetry literature involves verse. And notice I also say novels in verse on the screen. I've just said prose includes novels. There is a difference between novels and novels in verse. If a novel is written poetically in verse, then it can be performed in the poetry contest. Don't get that confused. So what is poetry? Well, it has a rhythm about it. It's not ordinary speech. It actually focuses in very concretely on drawing an emotional response from your audience. It's arranged according to meaning, sound, and rhythm, very much the opposite of what prose is. So there are your 2 contrasts and your 2 contests, which have evolved from that. I said you had to do 2 performances, and there was a category A and a category B. So this is going to be the technical part of my presentation today. So this may be where you want to take notes or just pay very close attention so that you learn what your 2 categories can come from. So let's go to category A of prose. The title is called This Is Me, and I think you see why in just a moment. Always when we write a category, we work on the first statement of the paragraph that describes the category with the goal. What is the intent of this category so that you as a competitor and your coach can understand that? So the goal of category A of prose is to examine a performer's ancestry, origin, heritage, and or dreams and aspirations. Now let that soak in for just a moment. Let's see where we're headed with this category. Ancestry, origin, heritage, and or your dreams and your aspirations of what you want your life and your future to be. Here's the requirements that you have. You can read a single literary work of prose, or you can read an excerpt of a prose. Excerpt means simply a portion of it or a cut, what we call a cutting of that prose. Or you can actually create a program where you take up to 4, you can have no more than 4 literary works that you put together to make this program. Do know that the majority of your performance must be published prose. That's important, and I'll discuss that in just a moment a little bit deeper. It could be fiction. It could be nonfiction that you choose. Now look at some of the examples I list on the screen because it fits perfectly with the goal of this category. You could use oral histories. You could use testimonies. You could select interviews, even letters that make up your performance. Co-authored, meaning more than one, and anonymous works, meaning we don't know who really wrote it, are permissible in this category. Your performance, as I mentioned earlier, requires that you have an introduction, that you begin your performance setting the mood, the tone, getting our attention, and giving us information that we need as an audience and as a judge so that we can listen and absorb and appreciate to a great extent your performance. So the introduction and/or transitions, a transition would be a sentence that bridges one selection you've taken to another. So that's what a transition is. So the intro or the transitions shall, there's that word I mentioned, shall, that means mandatory, include all titles and authors read and should connect the literature to the goal of the category. So two things that introduction and/or transition must do, and that is point us in the direction of the goal that we just went through about ancestry, origin, heritage, dreams, and aspirations, but also give credit where credit is due. So it's important that we get all the names and all the titles of the selections and authors that you're using. Sometimes people think that's too cumbersome to put all of those in an introduction if you're going all the way up to the maximum of using 4 pieces of literature. So that's why we allow you the choice. You can put them all in your intro, or you may spread them out and put them in some of your transitions if you make the decision you want to use transitions in your program. So you have an option there. Another rule in the category is that if you weave your literature, and as a brand new person just getting your feet wet with prose and poetry, weaving is tough. Weaving is a more advanced skill, but basically it's discussed in your prose and poetry handbook at great length. But here, I'll just tell you that it's where you take multiple pieces of literature and you piece them together, multiple selections that are pieced together in order to create an entire program. If you do decide to weave, you must tell us that in your intro. The judge and the audience needs to ethically know that you have woven these pieces. Even though you put them and piece them together, they should still, as you perform them, show a distinction so that we know when you're changing from one selection to the other. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, and I've got more to talk to you about the rules and the categories. Let's move to what the restrictions are. You may use 1 to 4 selections in category A. If you only choose to use one piece, then it must be published. All right, published means hard copy, you find it in a book. Even if you locate it originally on the internet is not a published source, which means that if you find it on the internet, you must also go find it. Where is it published in a book that has been through the formal editorship process where a publishing company said, this is great stuff, let's invest in making a hard copy book of it. If you use multiple selections, remember 1 to 4, then you are allowed, and this is fairly unusual, but a new category here that is allowing you one selection can be unpublished. Now, if you think about the goal of this category and the kinds of literature you're going to be looking at, like oral histories and interviews, it would make sense that we designed it with one selection to be unpublished, because you may actually go find a great uncle, a great aunt, a grandma, a great grandmother, a granddad, to tell you stories of your family as you examine and you explore your own family's ancestry. So that's why the one selection may be unpublished if you use multiple selections. Look at the bowl there. This is not a solo acting competition. It is asking you to look at literature, no plays, movies, monologues, or speeches in prose category A. You are expected to read in English because the majority of your judges, that's what they will understand. Sometimes your literature has a few words that are in another foreign language. That's fine. International language is fine as long as it's only incidental, small amount. No contestant shall use the same writer in more than one category. There's your word shall again, which means that once you make your selections and choose the authors you're going to perform in category A, even if you fall in love with an author, that same writer cannot be performed in category B. That's what that particular restriction refers to. And the last restriction there is no contestant shall use selections from the same literary work more than 1 year at UIL state meet. So if you qualify and you actually perform a piece at state, you've gone to the top level. Why in the world would you want to come back another year of your eligibility and try to read the same piece, the same literary work? So that's prohibited. Now, with every category, there is a documentation requirement. Documentation is simply asking you to prove that you've met the category. Why do we have documentation requirements? Because UIL takes great pride in trying to create an even playing field. It would be very unfair for another contestant competing against you to just read whatever they want and not worry about it fitting the category. Should they be allowed to do that when you have worked hard to select literature that actually fits the goal and the purpose of this category? That would not be an even playing field. So each competitor in prose, as well as each competitor in poetry, must provide documentation at the contest that your contest director running the event will check. Let's look at category A's of prose documentation requirements. Contestants shall, there's a mandatory word, prepare and provide hard copies of the UIL Prose A documentation online form and provide that for the contest director and every judge that you might have. So what will become important to you is getting to know the UIL oral interpretation webpage. That's where you'll find that form, and it's very easy. It's interactive. It's a digital form that you can just type in, download, print, and make extra copies to make sure you have one to hand to your contest director and that every judge you might possibly have in that tournament. So think about the fact you don't always just have one judge in a room. Sometimes you have multiples, sometimes 3. So you would want to make sure that you go to every competition that is UIL and make sure you have enough copies to go around. Contestants shall provide proof of publication for your selections used. So I've got to go in with this documentation online form that I have printed, and I also must be able to prove to that contest director that I have followed the rules and I've selected literature that is published, unless I have the one when using multiple that does not have to be published. So, all right, technical again, but let's plod through this because I think you can get it. It's pretty easy. Here we go. Examples of acceptable proof of publication. First of all, do you have the book that this selection is in? If you do, you can just show that to the contest director. But we know that sometimes you can't afford to buy the book, or maybe you have checked it out of a library and can't have it, keep it forever for all the contest levels you might go to. So you are allowed to photocopy. If you will flip the page open, that first page, you'll see on the left-hand side the copyright. Photocopy that copyright of the original source, and that's going to prove to your contest director that it indeed is a published source. I'd also copy the title page to show that that goes along with it. But that's very easy to do. Have the book, or take the book, photocopy the copyright page, the title page, and you're set to go. What if I can't do that? I think another really good source, and one that I would always go to as one of my first research for documentation, is go to your computer and Google the Library of Congress cataloging. What you'll find there is a web page, and you can click on Main Report, and you'll see that the full report of your book may be there, of where your selection is. If it's the book itself, you can print that out as on hard copy and have that ready to show the contest director. Now, sometimes that's a little tough because the title of that book may not be the title of your piece. It just happens to be in there. And what you have is a piece that came from a literary collection, sometimes what we call an anthology, where there are lots of different short stories in it. Okay, now what do I do? Well, look at your slide and you'll see that you could photocopy the table of contents that designates the title of the book, shows that the selection is included, also photocopying the first page of the selection so that the number on that page matches that table of contents in that book. Print out from an acceptable online source can be used. In other words, can I go to the internet? Can I go to a website and be able to try to prove that this selection is published in a certain book? Yes, you may. Just make sure that when you download that page, you have made sure that your download prints the URL from the website. You can't just write in the URL. You must actually have it downloaded and printed out. Now, I've not given all the details about each of these examples, but I will tell you that our UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook is going to be your guide. If you take a look at Chapter 3 of that book, it will explain in great detail. If you still don't understand, go to your coach, ask them to explain. And if they need to contact me about specific examples or questions with your documentation, I'll be happy to answer that in an email from the state office. There's category A of prose. Now remember, you have that second performance. What is that second performance in B of prose? It's entitled, This Speaks to Me. Think about that for just a moment. This speaks to me. I think you're going to love this category because it is so free and open. The goal of category B is to select literature that speaks to the performer. In other words, it's reader's choice. What is a piece of literature that you just absolutely love, that has a message for you, that speaks to your soul? That's what you want to read in category B. And that's what you can read, as long as it is either a single work of prose, or an excerpt, or you use no more than 4 literary works that go together that make this reader's choice category B. Could be fiction, could be nonfiction. Look on the screen to see what else it could be. Think about this. It could be a news source. It could be speeches. Maybe Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speaks to you. Maybe John F. Kennedy's inaugural address speaks to you. Maybe something by civil rights leader John Lewis speaks to you. That could be used in this category. It could also be an essay. It could be letters. Letters, sometimes World War II letters between a husband and a wife, a sweetheart. It could be diary entries. And you can use co-authored works. More than one person could have lent their pen to make this one work. Again, let's go back and you'll see some parallels here. Introductions and transitions shall include all titles, authors, and look at the bold, state why the literature was chosen. In other words, in your introduction, as you share with your audience and your judges, tell us, how does this speak to you? Why is this piece of literature important to you personally? That's where you personalize. That's where the audience gets to know you. If it's woven, you must absolutely shall state it in the intro, and we should be able to tell the difference between each of the pieces that you have woven. All right, do we have restrictions? Well, I don't like the word restrictions. I really think of them as boundaries. There's your box that's drawn for you for category B. 1 to 4 selections may be used. Now look at this. This is a lot different than what you see in category A, which is a lot more traditional. Category B says you can use published material, but you can also use something on the internet that's not published in a hard copy book. You can even transcribe something. So it may be that someone has posted a poetry slam event on YouTube and you want to go listen to it and you love a piece that's recited there. You can actually transcribe that, write down the words to that. I use the example of poetry and I probably shouldn't have, don't let me confuse you. A prose, as long as it's the prose genre, you could transcribe that. Notice, here's your restriction, here's your box. Anonymous works shall not be used, shall not. So even though you can in one category, different in category B. Again, no plays, movies, and monologues. Read it in English. Don't use the same writer you used in the other category. And don't use a selection that you already performed at UIL State previously. So how do we document this category to say, yes, I met it? You know what? It's very, very easy. You just go to the UIL website, to the oral interpretation webpage, and you fill in Prose B documentation form. Make your copies for the contest director and for each judge. And then no proof of publication. Remember, it can be off the internet, it can be transcribed, so there would be no reason to have to prove publication like you are required to do in category A. All right, you may be one of those students sitting in the audience that's saying, oh, but I love poetry. I'm there with you because poetry is a passion in my world. So let's see, I think I can go through this a lot faster now that we've gone through all the details of prose. And the reason I say that is to make it easier on your speech team and easier on your coach, we actually made these categories in poetry parallel to those in prose. So what you're going to see is same titles and very, very similar. We call category A again, This Is Me, just like we did in prose. What's that goal? The goal is to take poetry and through poetry examine a performer's ancestry, origin, heritage, and or dreams and aspirations. Now notice here's where a little bit of a difference happens, contrast from prose, in that you can read one poem, you can read a portion of a poem, or you can actually create a program. You can use up to 6 poems. Now remember in prose we said 4 is the maximum. The reason we allow you more in poetry is that poems tend to be a lot shorter and you've got that full 7 minutes there. So we allow you 6 in poetry. Now there is something else that's different in poetry from prose, and that is, notice this second statement here. If song lyrics are used as transitions, and we talked about what a transition is, it's a bridge from one poem to the next, it shall be stated in the introduction. So you want to alert your judge to this. What some students do is they love the lyrics to a particular poem, to a particular piece of music, and they want to sort of let those be their transitional bridge. So they want to use a little bit of the lyric, read a poem, little bit more of the lyric, read a poem, etc., as if it's a thread that goes through the performance. You can do that as long as you tell in the introduction that you are using that song lyric. If woven, it shall be stated in the intro, and you must see the differentiation when you actually perform those pieces. All right, what is our Poetry A restriction? You may use 1 to 6 selections. If you only use one, it has to be published. Anything on the internet that you find must also be published in hard copy concurrently. If you use multiple selections, one of those poems can be unpublished. You may not use plays, movies, monologues, or screenplays. And the rest you see, read it in English, don't read the same poet in both category A and B, and don't use the same piece you performed at state. So what are your documentations? They look almost identical to those in prose. You fill out the Poetry A documentation form that you'll find online and make copies for the contest officials. You provide proof of publication, except for that one you might have if you're using multiple. Same explanation I gave earlier. In particular, pay attention to the one when I discuss literary collection, because you're typically going to find poems in a literary collection. Rarely is there a book that only is published for one poem. So most of the time you're going to find those in anthologies. So this is the contest procedure that you will want to use. Category B of poetry, guess what? We call it This Speaks to Me, just like we did in prose, and it is reader's choice. You may use a single poem, a cutting of a poem, or you can take up to 6 poems and make those, use 6 poems to create a beautiful performance. You may love traditional classic poetry. It can be used in this category because, again, it's what speaks to you. You may like very contemporary poetry. You may like novels in verse, and those are allowed. And co-authored works are permissible. Same reference to intros and transitions. And in that intro, you should tell us, why did you choose this poetry? How does this poetry make an impact on you? If it's woven, you got to state it, and it has to be distinguishable. 1 to 6 selections. You may use published, internet, or transcribed literature. If your song lyrics are only published as music, you shall not use those. You shall not use those. Anonymous works shall not be used. Again, always look and relook at your category boundaries, those restrictions, because they differ from category A to B, both in prose and poetry. What's your documentation? You fill out the Poetry B documentation form, make copies for all your contest officials. No proof of publication for category B is required. So super easy, just fill out the form and make the copies. This slide is very critical. Coaches, even if you're a veteran coach, I want you to look at this because it's brand new in all the categories for this year, and that has to do with addressing copyrighted material. When you use copyrighted material, each UIL school is responsible for obtaining permission from the publisher for their participant to use the material. UIL will not assume responsibility for copyright permission to perform material. So make sure that all of your students have permission if they are using copyrighted material, and they need to get that officially from the publisher or the author. All right, let's make a transition here. We've talked a lot about detail and categories, and that's taken us a little bit of time. But those of you who understand and are very careful about paying attention to those category boundaries, you'll be the ones that are successful. People who don't pay attention to detail will show up at their district tournament and not even be allowed sometimes to perform because they did not follow the rules in the categories. So we've got that all down pat now. Let's talk a little bit about, well, how do I prepare? I know the categories. I've done number one. I've selected the literature that I want to perform. Now what do I do? First of all, you got to understand what you're reading. So don't just assume when you read it a few times that, oh, I know everything this poem means, or I know everything this short story means. You also need to do research. You need to analyze. You need to think about and read about and research your author or your poet. Maybe there's a particular thing that's happened in their world, in their life, that caused them to write a particular thing. Shelley Wagner, a wonderful poet, writes an entire book of poetry about the drowning of her young son and how she walked through the levels of grief and how she dealt with that tragedy in her world. If you don't know how personal that was to her, you really can't perform to the ultimate level that you could had you done your homework. So understand the text and read about your author. Prepare those introductions. For some people, that's very easy, and for some, it's not. Sometimes you have to go to your coach and say, can you give me a clue where to go? Please don't let your coach, and coaches, please don't write those intros. Please allow your students to do that. That's part of the performance process. But certainly help them. You want to practice your delivery because you don't want to perform an introduction. The performance comes later when you're reading someone else's literature. In the introduction, you want to be spontaneous. You want to be very prepared, but don't make it sound like you are reciting something. Do not be robotic and don't be overly dramatic. So many times in coaching students, I've said, do not perform your introduction. Yes, ma'am. They'll open their binder and they'll instantly start performing. You want to be careful. First of all, you don't do your introduction traditionally with your binder open. There are lots of unwritten rules that you will be able to discover if you watch our other video that we're releasing called The Unwritten Rules of Interpretation. And I really hope that you'll watch all of the video resources we're providing for you in prose and poetry. Be yourself in the introduction. It's a time when the judge and the audience, and the only time they get the opportunity to meet you as a person, not the writers that you're going to share with them. Next, you got to cut that literature. When I say cut, I mean go through it and make sure that you are within the time limit. If you perform at UIL, remember the maximum time is 7. If you go 7:02, 7:05, that contest director is obligated to disqualify you. So you don't want to get in that situation. Always go right underneath 7. 6:45 is a good, safe time, in my opinion. But you want to cut your literature. Sometimes, if you're cutting prose, you can get rid of some of the narration. You can get rid of the he says, she says. I won't go into detail about cutting today, but there is an art to it. And if you will refer to the UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook, there's a huge section in that book that will share with you all the different ways you can cut your selection. Also consult your coach. Consult friends who maybe haven't read the literature, but hear you read it before it's completely cut and say, they might say, hey, I think you could get rid of that. I don't think that's as important to the storyline. But do consult the handbook. It's going to help you a lot. Prepare your manuscript. You want to mark it. You want to score it. Just like if you happen to be a band member or you play the piano, You know that your score tells you when to get loud, when to get soft, when to get faster, when to get slower. That's the same thing you want to do with your prepared manuscript. Again, the handbook shows you how to do that, and I'm sure your coach can help with that as well. This is the time when you make performance decisions. You decide on special things that you want to do, you don't want to do, gestures you want to have. Performance decisions come into play. And then always make sure before you go to contest that you have studied the UIL rubric on how this judge is going to approach your performance. What are they going to critique you on? Make sure you know that. Look at the ballot in advance and know what you're working toward. You've prepared, now you rehearse. And remember my statement over and over, it's not an acting contest, it's oral reading. So the focus should naturally be on your voice. So you won't be doing a lot of extraneous movement. You won't have a lot of gestures. Gestures and movement should only be done when it is motivated by the literature, when the literature demands that you gesture because of a line within it to make it more effective, not distracted. And you certainly don't want to do gestures just because you're nervous and you can't keep your hands still or you can't keep your feet still. So be careful. Let the focus be on your vocal quality. And use your facial, use your eye expressions. Eye focus placement with characters becomes important so that your audience can tell the difference between when different characters are speaking. Posture changes. Vocal variety is the key. You don't want to just get up and read. Reading something without stumbling is okay, but it's not performance. You want to have a lot of variety. Let your volume get loud or soft depending on the meaning within the line. Work on your tone. You don't want to be happy-go-lucky when it's a very sad moment within the literature. Look at your pitch. Make sure you don't let your pitch get out of control or go too high, even during some very excited moments that might happen in the literature. You want to make sure that your pacing is indicative of what is going on in the literature. Should it be very slow? Should it be very quiet? Should it be very fast because something exciting is going on? You have to look at the literature and make your vocal variety match what the meaning that author had going on in that particular portion of the selection that you've chosen, or selections that you maybe have chosen. So work on volume, tone, pitch, and pacing. And something I didn't put there, but I want to use this term too, pause. Mature performers will realize the importance of pauses. Silence. Sometimes silence can say a lot more than if we shout a word or a phrase. So think about that. Don't be afraid of silence. Don't be afraid of effectively using pauses as you rehearse. And the fourth thing I've listed there is polish your book work. You have a binder that you have placed your manuscript in. Traditionally, that's going to be black. It's going to be small. It's going to be a 3-ring binder. We have descriptions in great detail in the UIL Prose Poetry Handbook about that binder. You use black because it doesn't distract as much as a bright color or a white, something that would stand out. You don't want the focus to be on that binder. You want it to be on the literature itself. So you want to work with that binder with your manuscript inside to smoothly open, close, turn your pages. Again, this is where your coach and your squad members can be so helpful, and also refer to the handbook. We are now to performance. We have researched, we have practiced. Now we're ready to go to a tournament. Be aware of what you pick out to wear and do that well in advance. Clear it with your coach. Make sure they've looked at it. You want to dress professionally. In speech and debate, the moment you walk in the door, you are being sized up and you are being evaluated. And your attitude about the competition comes through with what you've chosen to wear that day. You want it to be pressed, you want it to be clean, you want it to be professional. Most likely your coach has given you a dress code. If you've ever been to a tournament before, you'll notice that there are some traditional attire that most speech performers will wear. Be very conservative in your approach. That's always the safe way. And realize that your pride in how you look makes you feel good and it builds that self-confidence in you. You want to make sure that you don't wear things that are distractive. For girls, that would be dangly earrings. Don't wear those big dangly earrings because they bounce when you walk and when you talk. And that's all we're looking at instead of listening to your literature. It can be very distractive. If you're a guy, that Bugs Bunny tie just isn't going to work. We're thinking about Bugs Bunny and not your literature. So visit with your coach. Make sure you're within the squad criteria for what your coach has laid out as proper attire, and make sure that it accentuates and does not distract from your professionalism. Also, when you're at that tournament, you need to behave professionally. I think probably one of the greatest things that experience in speech and debate does is that it creates poise and professionalism in students that they can carry on in other walks of life as you get into your career, your profession. You want to make sure you're prepared. You want to make sure that you are focused. And one of the ways to do that is make sure you warm that voice up. Those vocal cords need to be warmed up. Even if your competition starts at 8 a.m. in the morning, be ready. It also allows you during those warm-ups to get very focused on what you are about to do. Always be early to your round. Don't go looking for your competition room right at the time it's supposed to start, because first of all, you may get lost. Second of all, walking in late is not making a good impression on judges. And if at all possible, unless you're cross-entered in another event, you need to stay for the entire round. You need to show respect for the other performers in the room. And you need to be a very good, quiet listener. Don't be fidgeting. Don't be writing things down. Don't be flipping your folder or kind of reciting your intro while you're sitting in your chair. Pay attention to other performers. Such a great way to learn and to hear great literature from other people. The last thing I've written there is respond professionally. Yeah, sometimes when you get a ballot back, you think, gosh, was this judge even listening to me? Did they get it? Where were they, out in La La Land? You want to have that tendency to criticize somebody who ranked you 6th or ranked you 4th in the round. Why didn't they love this performance as much as I did? But you want to be very careful, and this is where professionalism comes in. Do not criticize your judges. Even if you think you're in a quiet place where nobody else is around, you'll never know if a judge is standing around the corner or somewhere within hearing distance. So do not verbally criticize your judges. If you want to wait till you get back in that squad van and tell your coach how you feel, that's one thing, but don't do it at the tournament. Don't overreact. If you win, sometimes in award ceremonies, people just get way too over the top excited. And it's great to feel good about what you've done and to be rewarded for it. But you also want to be professional. Don't rub it in to those other competitors who also have worked very hard and who were holding their breath, hoping their name was the one called for the gold medal. And if you lose, don't overreact either. Again, be professional. Be sportsmanship and ethical in everything you do. Make sure you display that sportsmanship. Very critical. You see the ultimate goal of, yes, sure, the gold medal at UIL State, the Texas State champion. What could be more exciting? And certainly that is your goal, your ultimate goal. But I want you to know, students, that there's much more reward to being a part of prose and poetry at UIL than that gold medal. Not everybody can win that gold medal, but the journey you take in learning literature, in learning about great writers, in discovering yourself through the performances that you develop, enjoying the ride of being a part of a team, a squad, and all those experiences of eating in restaurants together, staying in hotels together, all the things that come to fruition, and meeting people from other schools and networking, people you may end up in college with. As you walk across a college campus, you may see a competitor. I hope you've made a great relationship with them so that can further your own life and your own career. So always remember, competition is a journey, but not a destination. I can't teach you everything about preparing for prose and poetry and competing, but what I can do is point you in the direction of where can you find help. I talked a lot about documentation for your categories. There is a helpful checklist that is amazing put in the UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook that are specific to these categories. Use it. Coaches, make sure you look at it so you can help your students. Make sure they've crossed every T and dotted every I before that district meet when they have to produce that documentation. Where do I get those oral interp documentation forms for the categories? You go to the web page and you just type them in and download them there. How do I understand the depth and the ins and outs of the categories beyond what has been discussed today? And how do I know all the details that go into practicing, performing, competing? The UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook is an amazing piece of guide and help for you. It is revised every single year. I'm very excited that this year we have something new called the Competitor's Edge. And the Competitor's Edge are really wonderful, insightful coaching recommendations that coaches all over the state who've been very successful in UIL Prose and Poetry have offered up so that we could publish those in the handbook. So make sure you look at the brand new revised edition of the UIL Prose and Poetry Handbook. Cannot tell you how amazing it is. Probably the best textbook for teaching oral interpretation, coaches, that you will find anywhere around. So that's where you can find help. Always the UIL website. And I am always available. Email's the best way to get in contact with me. I do want to warn you that I also run 6 other contests, and about the time you get ready for UIL District of Prose and Poetry, I'm actually running the UIL CX Debate State Tournament, the world's largest policy debate tournament with over 800 rounds of competition. So I'm fairly busy right before you go to district. So make sure by March the 1st, you get all those questions answered if you need my help. But I certainly don't mind. I also have a wonderful prose and poetry consultant, Melissa Heineman, who is the director of forensics at Tyler Junior College in Tyler, Texas, and she is very much available to help answer questions. So we are here for you. We love these competitions in prose and poetry, and we hope that your venture is wonderful. Again, don't forget, we have lots of other student activity conference videos that add to your resources for prose and poetry, as well as on the website. Call us, contact us, we're here for you, and enjoy your journey through UIL Prose and Poetry competition. Thank you for joining us today.